We're able to hear you in the room.
So we're up with.
Oh, cool.
Oh, nice.
Okay. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for being here on time. I'm sorry we're starting a little bit late. My name is Susie. I'm with the Black Rose Anarchist Federation. I just wanted to do a couple of housekeeping things and then introduce our speakers. So this event is being live streamed and recorded. The live stream and the recording is only to the front of the room where I am right now. We will have time for an open discussion and some questions at the end. But before we go into that, if anybody doesn't want to be recorded, we'll give you an opportunity to leave the room for that part. I'm going to be moderating today's discussion. I wanted to also welcome everybody who is listening, who's not in the room right now. And for their benefit, let them know that it's a balmy 39 degrees here in Boston and pretty cloudy. And we're going to be here for the next hour, hour and a half for the presentation. For folks who, again, aren't in the room, if they want to ask questions at the end, they can tweet them to Black Rose. It's BRRN_Fed at any time during the discussion. Our talk today is called A Feminist Movement to End Capitalism. It's focused on the historical development of Chilean feminism and how we can draw on their wisdom and practices to build a powerful new movement. We're lucky to have two founding members of Black Rose leading our conversation today, Romina Akemi and Bree Busk. Romina and Bree are also members of Solidaridad in Chile, a libertarian communist organization. And Bree and Romina have collaborated on several papers together that have helped to define the feminist practice of Black Rose, as well as to give an analysis of our moment here in the United States. Some of those papers include some that we have on the table here today and are available on the Black Rose website. Breaking the Waves, Challenging the Liberal Tendency in Anarchist Feminism. A Conservative Threat Offers New Opportunities for Working Class Feminism. And A Feminist Movement to End Capitalism, The Rise of Multi-Sectoral Feminism in Chile. Romina is joining us today from Los Angeles, and Bree is joining us from Santiago, Chile. So please welcome Bree and Romina. So hold on, girls, just a second.
What do you want to do first?
So I'm going to turn them around until we can get connected to our big screen. So who's starting? Bree, are you starting or is Romina?
I'll start and then Romina can introduce herself personally and then we'll get going with the content.
Okay. So go ahead, I can hear you.
Great. So hi, everyone. I wish I could see you. My name is Bree. I'm originally from the US, but I've been living in Chile for 3 years now. And Romina has been my writing and theoretical discussion partner that entire period. And we're really interested in kind of studying the feminist movement here in Chile and using that information to see our political work in the US differently. Okay. Romina?
Yeah. Hi. So I'm Romina, and I'm Chilean American, hence some of the connections with Chile. And I'm a member, as mentioned, of Black Rose and Solidaridad. And one of the things that I wanted to also mention is that a lot of our feminist theory really is based on our positions on anarchist, or is informed by our positions on anarchist communism. So we really begin with our politics, and our politics based on praxis, not just an ideology, but on political movement. So we think both those aspects are really important in kind of putting together our analysis. All right, so I think I should get started.
Yeah, let's go.
All right, so the slides, should we just let them know when to switch the slides, or I'm not?
Yep,
Yeah.
you can tell me.
Okay, so on the first slide, I mean the second slide, that besides the intro slide, the next one.
Yeah. Next.
Hold on. Oh no, we lost them.
You guys.
Oh, you can see us. Okay, well, that's very lovely.
Look for the next crowd.
Yeah.
All right, so hold on.
All right.
Let's get your slides back.
Where's it being live streamed?
The live stream is on Facebook right now from the Black Rose Federation homepage. And we're going to take just a brief pause because we have some new equipment and we're hoping that we can get the presentation on a large screen.
Oh, nice.
Hey, all right.
Yay!
So let's.
Couldn't be happier.
I don't understand how to slide. Okay, so how do I make this bigger?
Okay, so we were screen sharing.
It's great. It's easy.
Whoa.
Okay, so now that's displaying to everybody, so you can just
How do I make it bigger?
drag from the corner.
There's a little.
Like,
Susie.
Well, we need it to be in the window. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Okay. All right, guys. So I'm going to slide 2.
Perfect. So we actually wanted to begin with the question of memory and history, because memory and history are a very important basis in how people do politics in Chile. And we wanted to begin with this quote from Gabriel Salazar, who is a very famous Chilean historian on labor movement and social history, who's recently retired. But he, anyways, he's written. He was himself a member of a political organization and went into exile and such. So he is a historian with a political consciousness and has devoted a good amount of his life to political work. And this slide, it says, "It is dangerous to be poor, but more dangerous to be poor and not forget." And this is based on the history of the dictatorship in Chile, which is some of you might not know about. But in Chile, we had a military dictatorship from 1973 to 1989, 1990. And that was a dictatorship that was headed by General Augusto Pinochet. And maybe some of you have heard that the United States was involved with that dictatorship. But for Chileans, the question of the dictatorship or the memory of the repression of the dictatorship is not just about the dictatorship, but it was what the dictatorship was meant to accomplish. And the goal of the dictatorship was to raise a memory of prior to it, when the socialist president Salvador Allende, or Dr. Salvador Allende, took power in 1971 from the elections 1970, and what he represented was actually something much larger and much deeper. That we had created a vast social movement in Chile that was about to overthrow capitalism. And even though some people might think Allende might be something like a charlatan or not truly a socialist, I would actually really disagree with that. He did really believe in what he fought for. We don't agree necessarily with his tactics to do so, but he was not he was truly devoted to the socialist cause and had been part of building socialist movement in Chile from his youth, including being part of a 12-day socialist republic in the 1930s. That itself is a very interesting story, but we can't go into it here. But why do you want to begin with that? Well, one, in Chile, during the period leading up to the dictatorship, you had a really deep politicization of the working class, that including the taking over of factories, even though the socialist government did actually expropriate some factories themselves, including a list of over 230 industries that were nationalized and expropriated. But from that, other industries, other workers from other industries decided to take over themselves, and also peasants from mainly in southern Chile decided to expropriate lands themselves. So even though the socialist government representative, a sort of kind of like state kind of overseeing body that actually took control over some industries and was trying to attempt a very kind of controlled socialist kind of maneuver towards eventually getting rid of capitalism, what you actually gave birth to was also a working class independence, and a really deep consciousness of what it meant to be, what it meant to have workers' control. So when the dictatorship came in, and it was supported by the United States, but I think it's also unfair. Many Chileans think that it's very unfair to give the United States all the credit. They deserve some, but we actually have our own fascists in Chile too, and it wouldn't have been possible without a sector of the dictatorship, of the ruling elite, and a sector of the middle class aligning themselves with fascism, and eventually leading the overthrow of the Allende government. But that's the other thing. It was not an overthrow just of the Allende government. It was the dictatorship was intended to kill off an entire generation of people who wanted to overthrow capitalism. And they wanted to erase that memory, and they wanted to kind of just eliminate that entire generation. And many people thought maybe that actually did happen, because a good portion of the 1970s, not that much happened politically because of the repression was so deep. So many people went to exile, a lot of people were murdered and killed, and it created state terror. And it's also why Chile still continues to be a society of trauma. We're still dealing with that. But we're here to talk about feminism. So we wanted to kind of lay this out, because this is actually a very important part of the roots of the feminist movement in Chile. Now, during the 1960s and 70s, while there was a feminist movement in the United States, in Latin America, most women who were politically conscious were part of usually rebel groups, communist organizations, guerrilla movements, and such, right? But it doesn't mean that it didn't face gender exploitation. Now, much later on, by the 1980s in Chile, you have the revival of a social movement to fight against a dictatorship. You have students, you have workers, you have a lot of other elements, but feminists actually take a very important role in leading the resistance against Pinochet. Actually, we probably should be switching sides, but I don't know. Should I just say?
Just tell me when.
Oh, okay. All right. So we probably should have switched the slide already, because that image right there shows an image from the Allende period, which is crear poder popular, to create popular power, which was a very important slogan of the Allende period. And the next slide is here's an image, a very famous image of the coup, when you can see the Moneda, which is the presidential palace, being bombed. And now next image is here. So this is where kind of the story I want to begin, but it's a much older image. So this is an image of the of an organization called MEMSH, which is the movement, the movement for emancipation of Chilean women. If I got that right. And here you could see the banner in the back, where women who are for suffrage are carrying their banner demanding suffrage and such. Next image. Okay. So the fight for suffrage was in the 30s and 40s, and they won it, I think, in 45, if I remember correctly, 1945. So since then, there hadn't been much of a feminist movement in Chile. And in 1983, there was a congress called MEMSH 83, which was a revival of the feminist movement, led by famous Chilean socialist feminists who had been part of the original suffrage movement. So by 83, they were much older. And they really realized that feminists had to lead the struggle against the dictatorship for a couple of reasons. One, that the dictatorship itself represented the embodiment of patriarchy, which was a quote from the Chilean feminist and socialist Julieta Kirkwood, who's written some fantastic books about socialism, feminism, and political praxis, but unfortunately none of it is available in English. But if you want to read in Spanish, you can find PDFs online. They're all over the place. Chileans love to scan everything and put it online. And the other reason is that because the dictatorship was patriarchal, they actually had a very kind of strange kind of political relationship with women. One, they were trying to put women in their place, but two, they didn't really think that women could really be that much of a threat sometimes, including there's many stories of women who probably should have been arrested during the dictatorship for their leadership roles under the Allende government, and instead their husbands were taken away because they were like, oh, surely these women were not really doing this work. It was actually their husbands leading it. So MEMSH 83 became a leading force in resisting the dictatorship in the streets. Now, this image that you see on there, Democracia Ahora, Movimiento Feminista, is actually in front of the National Library in Chile, and is a historic photo of these many of these women who were part of this movement. And there's a lot of video clips out there of the massive street demonstrations led by women, in which the military was sometimes, like I said, ambivalent in how to repress them, and not like they didn't attack them or disappear them, but they also took a very different tactic of sometimes not arresting them right away, but following them on the streets and trying to just like low-key grab them and just like take them away and such, but not actually confront them so much in the streets. So they use the politics of patriarchy to their favor, which is something also the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo in Argentina, the mothers of the disappeared, did over there too. Now the next photo. So here's an image of Pinochet with the quote from Julieta Kirkwood, which we thought it was a great image of the embodiment of patriarchy. Here, the dictator himself. Okay, so another thing that I think the feminist movement that developed in the 80s represented was was that there was actually socialism was always a big part of their politics, and it was never seen as something entirely separate. Like I said, some of the main figures in the feminist movement were socialists themselves, and so that already kind of laid an interesting parameter when you're talking about feminism. You're talking feminism had this very link to social movement, to fighting against capitalism. So I think it places the discussion in a different place where it's at in the United States, for example, where there is in the United States the idea that feminism, socialism, like you can't really have a feminist world without thinking about socialism, is still being debated in the United States, right? So the next image. Should I talk about the ollas comunes?
That one is on the next slide.
Oh, that'd be it. Okay.
And the ollas comunes after that.
All right. So there's ways of organizing, and the way that feminists also organize, besides street demos, the street demos are just the aftermath. The street demos are not necessarily the organizing, you know? They're kind of a public display of resistance, but the real organizing also happens in other places. There was a couple of key places where women organized too. But I would say that the street demonstrations do represent the more militant side of those who are organizing. But a lot of those images of the street demos and the resisting are actually not the main part of the historical memory, which is very interesting, because I didn't find out that the women actually Memsheri 3 and the street demos and such were such a massive thing until like the 2000s on my own when I was studying. But what I did know about was other forms of organizing, which I do think are just as crucial, is the arpilleras, and which are sort of sewing circles, but that's not what arpillera means, and the ollas comunes. So the arpilleras, which are, I think the image that is on right now, was started out as sewing circles in the Catholic Church, actually, and it was meant for it was just sewing items. It was not sewing this first, and it was meant to give poor working class women, who many of them had family members that were disappeared, an income. So they would go there and sew. And then it also gave organizers a chance to talk politics and to give explanations for like what was going on politically. And it was to raise political consciousness and political awareness and give working class women a political language, to understand words like neoliberalism. What does it mean? To understand all kinds of other terms, and they learned it in these sewing circles. And there's lots of interviews out there that talk about this. The arpilleras themselves are images of what they experienced during the dictatorship. So a lot of them are images of their resistance. You see images there with like the photos of family members who were disappeared. So and then they were able to sell those arpilleras to make money. The next image are the ollas comunes. But these were, which ollas comunes mean like communal, what's olla?
Pot, like a communal pot.
Communal pot. There were it was also for survival, because the economic recession was so deep in the 80s that it was much cheaper, as many of you may know, that it's cheaper to cook collectively than it is individually. So you were able to, everyone bring in various items and throw it into the pot, but it also became a place to organize, right? Now, a lot of, like I said, the historical memory and literature emphasizes these kind of domestic spaces, and you can say, like the sewing and the ollas, and they de-emphasize the militant street protests. But as Bree will explain later on, there's been a sort of rekindling of that, all those memories together. Now, the 1990s, the dictatorship ended in 1989, 1990. And this begins the period where we call the return to democracy. And but there was a couple of things that were important about this period. One, unless you grew up in a political family like myself, you're actually not likely to know about the historical memory of what had happened, right, in the Allende period or during a dictatorship. And there was a lot of people who didn't. A lot of young people. I remember people who were my peers in the 90s that I realized that did not know who a lot of like the left folk protest groups were in the 70s. Well, that's what I grew up with. But I also grew up partially in the United States with exiled communities. So I was exposed to things that many young Chileans were not, because of the dictatorship. They could not hear those things. So the 90s were important for creating what was called the Memory Battleground. And why did that happen? Well, one is that a good sector of the people leading the political battles or list protests and street battles and organizing against Pinochet in the 80s. When the 90s, when the end of democracy, or the dictatorship was nearing, it became a lot of compromises were made. And some key compromises were that in order for democracy to return, they will keep the constitution that the dictatorship had put in place in 1980. And also, a lot of individuals decided that they would go into politics because they felt that going into politics, this is how we're gonna bring democracy to Chile. We're gonna go into political organizations and build the institutions of the state. So this kind of created more so of a political battleground or historical memory battleground, because it was a question of like, how will the memory and the legacy of Allende in the dictatorship be remembered when those who led the dictatorship still are not going to be punished and are still going to be important parts of power, right? So I think a lot of people think that when the democracy came in, that then Chile put all those people, those torturers and murderers in jail, but nope, that did not happen. That became a whole battle in of itself. So now put the next slide. Okay, so a very key figure and kind of, I would say, the embodiment of the what would be the legacy of both the return of democracy is our first female president, not the first president, I'll say not, first female president of Chile, which is Michelle Bachelet of the Socialist Party. There were several other presidents before her, but she was part of a coalition that had already been in power by a few presidents before, known as the Concertación, or the Concentration. And it was an alliance between the Socialist Party, Social Democrats, the Christian Democrats, and a bunch of other, even though the Christian Democrats go in and out, but they were in there for a good portion of it. And she represented what she called, she wanted neoliberalism with a human face. That's what she said. That was the embodiment of her politics. And she herself was a victim of the dictatorship. She was arrested as a teenager. So was her father, who was in the a general in the military, or actually in the Navy. And he actually died under torture. And her mother were tortured at a very infamous torture facility called Villa Grimaldi. Then she went to exile in East Germany and became a medical doctor, was married, had 2 children, then divorced her husband, is known as an agnostic, and she supports the right for abortion and has been president twice of Chile. And she's a very good example, I would say, of where the kind of contradictions that we face in Chile, of both someone who calls himself a socialist but supports neoliberalism, and someone who says they support a good portion of feminist demands, but yet also leads the repression against working class people. And so I'm now going to pass it on to Bree.
All right. Thank you very much, Romy. So next slide, please. So what you are seeing here is a little photograph of the National Stadium in Santiago, Chile's capital city. So the National Stadium was used as a mass detention and torture facility during the dictatorship. And in fact, today, one section of the seats is sealed off as a reminder of what happened there. But it's the big stadium. You have all your soccer games there. In the photo, you can see a placard above the door, and it says, "A people without memory is a people without a future." And this is a slogan that you will see kind of reoccurring, especially around the anniversary of the coup on September 11th in Chile. So contemporary Chilean feminists are really invested in this project of salvaging their history, of self-educating, of doing collective study, of examining historical acts of feminist resistance. Right? But the idea is not to find things to copy or to imitate completely, but to fit themselves into the legacy of Chilean feminism. You know, a legacy that has been really damaged by the dictatorship, which tried to eradicate even the memory of the possibility of another world. Right? So in 2018, we've seen like a big surge in feminist activity, and especially like a revival of historical feminist iconography, but also historical methods of resistance, many from the dictatorship. So next slide, please. So what you're seeing here is two images of a performance, one from the period of the dictatorship and one from a few months ago. So what they're depicting is La Cueca Sola. The cueca is Chile's national dance and is meant to resemble the elaborate courtship ritual between a rooster and a hen. So you can imagine like two dance partners doing some fancy footwork, each carry a handkerchief, which they use to kind of flirtatiously wave at each other. And it's a very like kind of fun, maybe a little dirty even dance, and it has a very positive feeling to it. But what we're seeing here, La Cueca Sola, or the cueca danced alone or without a partner, is a piece of performance art and also an act of rebellion. So when it's danced alone, this normally kind of exciting, cheerful, flirtatious dance can become like very sad, very mournful, or even very angry, depending on the emotions of the dancer. So the tradition of La Cueca Sola began during the dictatorship and was performed by members of the families of the disappeared, okay, who would dance alone with a photo, usually a photo of a family member or a loved one whose memory they want to keep alive, with that photo pinned to their chest. And they would dance alone. Okay? It's super, super powerful to watch this. And as I learned last September 11th, just a few months ago, when I witnessed my first performance in person on September 11th outside the presidential palace. So in the photo on the right, you can see a trans comrade dancing in front of the palace. So before she began her performance, she announced that she was dancing for the memory of all like the queens, the queers, the transvestites, all of the people who were basically gender rebels of the past, who were leaders in struggle, who did participate, and of course, who suffered or were murdered by the state. So in this way, the historical struggle against the dictatorship is kind of blended together and strengthened by being combined with the more recent struggle for queer and transgender rights. Okay, next slide. A little bit of history again. Here you can see an arpillera depicting a performance of La Cueca Sola during the dictatorship. Next. And now we have a contemporary arpillera. So this one was kind of, it speaks to the future of the struggle. So it was created by students in one of the occupied universities during the recent wave of feminist strikes earlier this year. So instead of depicting crimes of the dictatorship or documenting the historical struggle, they show names and portraits of victims of femicide. Femicide being the specific murder of women for, you know, patriarchal reasons like jealousy, or if women break the rules of their gender role, for example, by being lesbians or otherwise not doing what they're told. Okay? So they show femicide is very influential in Latin America as a whole. And so it's a natural evolution of this kind of creative tradition for young students to be making their own arrepieres about the issues that they feel affected by. Okay, next. Okay, so the Ollas Comunes also are experiencing a comeback. Here you can see an advertisement for one that was on September 10th, so the day before the anniversary of the coup. Feminists organized an Olla Común to connect the history of resistance to the contemporary struggle for free, safe, and accessible abortion. So they did a performance, they actually served food, they had conversation, and it was very cool. Right? So, and even the month after that, I saw an advertisement that they are going to be starting a new series of Ollas Comunes for migrants freshly arrived to Chile who can build community with native Chileans. So Chile is definitely receiving a lot of immigrants right now. And for that reason, there's also a rise in xenophobia. So feminists see it as part of their political duty to build community with migrants around their struggles, especially how the migrant struggles intersect with feminist struggles or the fight against racism or fascism. Okay, next. So another historical flashback. We can see the original logo of Mensch, and then on the right we can see a big banner showing the logo of the contemporary abortion struggle in Chile. In the background, you can see the woman with the banner from the old image, but in front you have a topless student with her little bandana on. And the image of like the topless student protester speaks directly to the recent upsurge in feminist struggle in the high schools and universities, where you would see big blocks of young women shirtless, often wearing like cool balaclavas, marching in the street. So in this image, I would say it symbolizes like a forward-thinking movement, but one that is grounded in the legacy of who came before. They are not starting from scratch. They are self-educated, they teach each other, they learn, and they apply what they've learned. And then they're not afraid to change things if what they're doing doesn't work. Okay, next. Okay, so this guy might be a little familiar for you. So we're back in the US now, right? So we have Malcolm X here. Armed with the knowledge of our past, we can, with confidence, charter a new course for our future. So the idea is, what can we do in the US to learn from memory? What is the purpose of memory for us? Right? So what does memory mean for US anarchists, feminists, anarchist feminists, or people who are, in other struggles? So it means that we really need to understand our own roots. I think we often can be quite ahistorical or have a lot of information about some things and then big gaps in our understanding of others. But if we can ground ourselves in our own history of struggle, right, we are better positioned to understand our present and from there determine our course for the future. So next slide. All right, so when we think of our anarchist heroes and martyrs, it's dangerous to view them as like valorized or symbolic individuals. Figureheads do not serve anarchists very well, in my opinion. Like when we think of Emma Goldman or other popular icons, we should ask, what groups and movements were they a part of? What did they do and how did they do it? What lessons did they learn and how did their strategy or politics evolve over time? So for example, we have Lucy Parsons here. Her face is super iconic. But what can we say about her role in the 1877 Chicago Railroad strike or her involvement with the International Ladies as Garment Workers Union? Like we need to place our political predecessors in context to truly understand their significance. Okay? That is where we're going to learn. Okay, next slide. Okay. Also, we don't need to restrict our historical interrogations to groups that represent our precise political perspectives, not only anarchist stuff. Studying the past clarifies the present, so we should take a look at everything that contributed to the current political landscape. For example, the Jane Collective, founded in Chicago, was an underground network created to address the shocking number of unsafe illegal abortions being performed while the procedure was still illegal. By building networks of allied doctors and receiving medical training to safely perform abortions themselves, Jane was able to reduce the danger and cost faced by individuals who wished to terminate their pregnancies. So my question is, why have we placed all our faith in the Supreme Court to protect our reproductive and non-reproductive rights? Anti-abortion activists have used both their grassroots and institutional power to reduce abortion access to almost nothing, right? Before even any laws are changed. So robust access has never been part of our reality. It's not something new. So when the Supreme Court starts to pick apart Roe versus Wade, are we going to withdraw to mourn at home, or are we going to organize to meet our needs through networks of support and solidarity? Okay. Next. Okay, so another example of our history to examine is the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, or ACT UP. It was a horizontally organized advocacy group formed in the late 80s in response to government inaction in the face of the AIDS pandemic. So through strategic, high-profile direct actions, ACT UP members forced the drug companies and the government to acknowledge and react to the health crisis. So again, I ask, when the government and its structures are responsible for the deaths and immiseration of so many people, will we patiently wait to vote away their violence, or will we act up for our own survival? What demands can we make on the system that will simultaneously reduce our short-term suffering while still building towards a revolutionary future? Okay. Next. So, análisis de coyuntura, or conjunctural analysis, is a way of understanding the context in which we want to act, looking to the past, analyzing the present, and planning for the future. So the quote is, coyuntura, not a method, but a way of thinking. Right? So it's not intended to be a formula, but a way of seeing things, a way of thinking. The goal of this process or this activity is to use political analysis to enact change. So it's not just a theoretical exercise, but a very practical one. So we're going to walk you through some of the steps. So next slide. So phase one. So during this analysis, we start by identifying ourselves and our interests. So we ask questions like, who are we politically? And again, Romina and I said we are going from a very specific perspective. We are not thinking as individuals. We are thinking as people who are part of a group, part of a social organization, part of a coalition, right? That we have a group of people with a group perspective, maybe one that's still in flux or in development, but this can be part of that development. So we ask, who are we politically? Where are we and what are we doing? What is our analysis of class, race, and gender? Who are we trying to recruit and who are we trying to be? Right? That's very important. Like, are we just a group of friends who are together because it's convenient and we have the same work schedule? Or are we a group that's united by a way of thinking, an analysis, a plan, and a shared vision of the future? Right? Also, how do we think change happens? Right? That's really important too, right? Because we need, if we have a method that we don't think affects change, then why would we use it? Right? Also, we have, how do prefigurative politics intersect with this process? Right? As anarchist communists, we believe in prefigurative politics. We believe that what we're doing now should reflect the world that we want to live in. So we are not going to say the ends justify the means. We want the ends and the means to be in accord with our values and practices. Okay, next slide. So phase 2 is naming the issues. You identify key issues or key struggles or fights of the sectors where we live, work, and study. So sectors are like the areas, right? It could be our neighborhood, it could be our job, it could be our industry. And study could be our high schools, our colleges, etc. Right? Identify and clarify opposing interests and contradictions, right? Because there's, for example, in a university, you are going to have many different factors. Some people support one thing, other people support another. The idea is not to ignore any of these, but to see them all together as part of a whole, to get a complete picture. Okay? Then we're going to ask, what is the history of struggle on this issue? What has been tried before? Okay? Or what is being tried now? And then finally, what do we want to accomplish? We want short-term goals and long-term goals. Okay, next slide, please. All right, so for example, we also, in naming the issues, we want to identify contradictions. Okay? So for example, if we're talking about the feminist movement or the feminist movement in the US, some potential contradictions could be some people say, yeah, we really want gender equality, but we're not so worried about economic or racial equality, right? That's a contradiction, because the idea that you could somehow create a little island of equality in an unequal system is very, I don't know, it's like a paradox, right? And then, right, you can also have the contradiction of being in a position where you are in some ways benefiting from a system, even while you suffer under it or receive oppression in other ways, right? So you might be the beneficiary of, like, for example, like racial privilege or white privilege, but you also still might face patriarchal oppression, right? So instead of ignoring these contradictions, we want to really look at them and interrogate them. So next slide. So what do we want to accomplish? So an example of a long-term goal and a short-term goal, right? Because they should be in accord with each other. A very long-term goal could be a libertarian society or an anarchist utopia. Would be nice for me. A short-term goal that could support that, right, is to develop individuals, build organizations, and grow movements, right? To create the infrastructure now so that we can take on larger and larger challenges in the future, right? We are not going to be able to go from zero to libertarian utopia, right? We need to really see the complete process of how we get from where we are now to where we want to be. Right? So the process of asking these questions and pursuing these long-term and short-term goals is that we can use these activities to highlight the contradictions and challenge the consciousness and goals of participants. For example, a participant who is only thinking of their struggle as a woman or their struggle against patriarchy could see that this really they need to be struggling on all fronts if they want to achieve their goal, right? That they have to expand their idea of what the struggle is to include other types of oppression. So, next slide, phase 3. So phase 3 is assessing the forces. Right? The forces are the agents, the people, the groups, the organizations, the political parties, all the players, right? So for example, political organizations, we could say Black Rose, or the DSA, we could be political organizations, right? We're not parties that are part of the mainstream system. Maybe you could say DSA is kind of on the border there since they do run some candidates. But generally, I would say political organizations. Next, we have social movements or social organizations. Those could be example like labor unions. You could have kind of broader movements like Me Too or even Time's Up. Institutional forces are like forces of the dominant system. So you can have the Democrats and the Republicans and NGOs. Right? They're incorporated into the system. So once we have those established, we can sort them out and then think, where do we belong and how do we relate to these others, right? Maybe some of these groups or organizations or movements are threats to us, right? Like, for example, a fascist movement. Others might be competition. For example, like a very similar feminist group that is very liberal and doesn't seek to kind of push the agenda, right? They might be competition for us and we would want to challenge their ideas, right? And opposition, same idea. Right? We can also be looking for opportunities and alliances. Maybe some groups or some movements are the perfect ones for us to unite with or collaborate with. And we can also think of strengths and weaknesses in this space for ourselves and for the other agents. Okay, next slide. So phase 4 is planning for action, right? Because that's the whole purpose. This is not an exercise of analysis for analysis's sake. It's about understanding the moment in order to act. So the idea is to anticipate the direction events will take and determine our actions in that context, right? We predict what will happen and think, what can we do now to be in the right place at the right time when that happens, right? We're anticipating the future, right? So where we want to be, an example could be, we want to be a part of a movement capable of challenging the structures of patriarchal capitalism, again, maybe long term. And we have to think, what do we need to do to be there, to reach that goal in 1 year, 5 years, or 10 years? Okay? And some sample answers could be, we need to lay down deep roots in strategic areas. Okay? If we decided something has some opportunities, that it's strategic, that it's important, even if we have low capacity now, we can start by building it there. Okay? We want to build authentic relationships. We don't want to be people who are just like chasing the ambulances of different crises or just reacting always to our oppositional forces. We want to build community, build political relationships, stay put, right? Because powerful movements are not built in like 5 minutes. Right? You need time and investment. Right? And in order to become more capable of achieving our long-term goals, we also need to expand our capacity by winning people over to our way of thinking. Not by just like aggressively recruiting them, but by convincing them, by showing our actions in practice, by talking to people, by being out there. Right? So we can build organically to have a better organized presence to accomplish what we want to accomplish. All right, very good. So for this next section, Romina will take over.
All right. So the next slide. All right. That. Well, do I have an echo now?
Bree, if you could go on mute, that'll stop the echo.
Okay, cool. Well, this is a very, I was gonna do some like Darth Vader coming to the stage noise with this image. The next part we want to talk about is both what to do and a little bit about more about the state of the United States and building mass movements. I think this image is a really good representation of what we have to confront in not just the United States, but around the world. The rise of fascism that you see taking place across the world, and including in Chile, because a fascist group did attack one of the feminist rallies too, and stabbed a couple of people. This was a few months ago. That, and also climate change and such, represents real threats that we have to organize against. And a really kind of a deep part of the re-emergence of fascism has to do with crisis of masculinity, which is why feminism is also extremely important. Now, one of the challenges that I think you can see in comparing the experiences in Chile with the United States is the question of mass movement. And in the United States, there's always been a difficulty in trying to create alliances or create commonality, at least in the last, I would say, last 30 or 40 years. And so we want to reemphasize a couple of points. There are some things that we mentioned already in the talk, but it's good to reemphasize. One, that by underscoring the question of the organization or having a perspective that is collective versus individual is one that what forces us to think beyond our own just personal experiences, which are important, but our personal experiences are also not representative of everybody. And if we really want to fight against fascism and if we want to end capitalism, we need to build mass movements. And we need to, how do we do so? You cannot really build a mass movement by saying one organization will represent them all. I mean, this is not Lord of the Rings, right? Not one rule, one ring. But it's has to do with, we have to think about alliance building, how we're going to build, how we're going to find commonality, how are we going to find other organizations to work with. And I really like a line that both Bree and I have been thinking about a lot is that we're organizing so we don't die. And this is how we have to think about it at this moment. I think in Chile, it's always been apparent because of the history of the dictatorship. We always knew that the stakes were high because even during the Allende period, people were aware that a dictatorship was coming and knew the stakes were high. Then we had a dictatorship where thousands were killed and tortured. So when democracy returned and the question of organizing in the 90s, what was always looming in everyone's mind, if we take this to a certain extent, will we have another dictatorship? Will we be killed once again? Well, we want to organize and we don't want to die. So how will we do so? And I think in the United States, I think because violence has been so normal, extreme violence has been so normalized in society that I don't know if it's like seen at the stakes at the same level, but I think people are really starting to feel it now. And so what do we need to do? Well, we, in order to build mass movements, it's not about just finding like universal demands, which a lot of people don't like, but I think it's not about a universal demand that fits everybody, but it's finding demands that could kind of connect a lot of people and a lot of social movements together so we can resist together, right? I think some of the kind of the issues of finding demands has been one that demands are considered reformist, but all demands really are, I mean, even abortion is a reform if we look at it, you know? So if the question is like, how do we use the demands for, I think Bree mentioned this one, for so that we can make our lives a little better right now. Maybe so we don't die right now too, so we can eat, so we can live. But then also, how do those demands then push the contradictions even further? So we can even push it even farther, convince people that in order so we can have a just society, we need to build a socialist society, right? Are the other slides mine afterwards too? Sorry, Bree is the slide maker. You're muted. You're muted.
Yes, they are.
Okay, thank you. All right, so the next slide. Now, this is a great image from the recent mass mobilizations that happened in Chile that really erupted in May. And I think this is the image that Bree mentioned also, that that is used partly in the bandana also, that has become sort of iconic. And in a lot of times, this has become very important. Well, one, Chile being a Catholic country, people are always looking to rebel against like what is considered not acceptable under Catholic society, and being naked is not one of them. So people love taking off their clothes. I feel like it's almost like a really interesting kind of form of rebellion that happens quite often. But what I want to talk about is the question of the student movement. Is that the next? Sorry, Bree. She, yeah, it's the next slide. Sorry, next slide. So what I want to talk about is the example of the student movement in Chile, which I think helps also connect with the feminist movement. Can you have the next slide, please? All right. So there's a demand, or there is a sort of organizational alliance building strategy in Chile called multi-sectoralism. And I want to explain that. By sectors, we mean sectors of how the economic system or society is organized. So labor can be a sector, students can be a sector, right? Women are not a sector because we're not a specific sector. We actually transverse a lot of these sectors. So we're like a space of struggle. That's kind of like how a lot of times has been kind of analyzed. But the student movement has been very key. It erupted in 2006. Something was known as the Penguin Revolution, because the uniforms, the high school students, their uniforms look like penguins, you could say, sort of. And it erupted as a high school student movement that was resisting against the privatization of education. That was part of the neoliberal policies of the time, and also against other things such as the SATs, which have a different name in Chile, but of also something that it's actually the same test pretty much that they have down there too. Even that has been globalized. Now, those high school students had then, when they became college students, led the big eruption of the student movement on the college movement level in 2011. So it's actually an interesting kind of thing that is like a generation of people that had that experience. Now, the university student movement of 2011 also became really massive, became very had a huge impact on Chilean society. There was a lot of people were supportive of it, and actually that was very interesting at the time because it was like so much support for the university student movement, and also the students realized that while they are a sector of society, they cannot shut down capitalism. They're students, right? They can shut down their universities, but there's only so much you can do. But they also realized that they could use the weight of the university student movement to support other sectors, right? And this was a sort of like kind of like the question of multi-sectoralism had already been there in Chile, but this was the first time that students felt that they could enact this, that they could, okay, let's put this into action. So what they did was then start to build alliances with unions, which wasn't very hard since virtually everyone who's in a kind of a position of leading the university student union are political and are connected to political organizations, and those political organizations have alliances and such. So it wasn't a huge stretch, but it was still significant. Workers, several unions have in the past with different student strikes shown solidarity by shutting down themselves, like shutting various industries down. But now this was another kind of important but now the students saying we're going to be part of, let's say, a general strike, or we're going to, when we have a press conference, we're going to talk about this, like, workers' issues and make it part of our demands and part of what we're resisting, was also significant. Next slide. Sorry. So this is a that's a very good. That's an image from a high school student protest in Chile. When the high school students take over their high school, they actually put their chairs on the gates to kind of represent, to show that they're on strike. It's also a very good method to stop gates from opening, but that usually is not the main thing. It's more kind of like a visual representation of the strike in itself. So the student movement, next image. And this is, I'm not sure what this is. This is probably an image of an asamblea, which is how the students organize. So when the high school students, for example, when they go on strike, they do so by having, they don't just, it's not some individuals decide to go on strike. They actually do so by having an assembly where all the students have discussions and debates. They vote on going on strike. They send representatives to larger assemblies where high school students all send their representative to go to these bigger assemblies to then decide on coordinating strikes and such. So the reason we're talking about the high school student and the college student movements is two things. One, the multi-sectoralism question that I was talking about, which is sort of questions of like alliance building and methods. But the other thing is that the assemblies, the form of organization, the form of strikes and such, like those elements were an important training ground for feminists themselves. Next image. And as the student movement exploded, so did the contradictions within the movement of not recognizing the issues that women were facing, or even not just women, but queer and trans folks were facing within the movement. And one of the things that came out of the university student mobilizations was the question of non-sexist education. And but also another thing that came up in these these struggles was, like I said, the contradictions of not being recognized. Sometimes women would gather together and discuss, things that were not included or thought about within the student movement demands. And some of the men in the organizations, or in some of these main organizations, would say like, oh, well, these women are having their kind of like girly meetings, or their whatever they would say to kind of minimize their issues that they were raising. So actually some organizations came out of these contradictions, including this group called La Alzada, which was an anarchist feminist organization that came out of another organization called FEL, which is the Libertarian Student Federation, which was an anarchist student federation. And they formed because they were not being recognized, and they needed to kind of create a space to develop their own politics and their own demands. Now, that's just one example. Out of that also came this question of non-sexist education, which was a broader demand, and actually led to conferences and other spaces and such, where a lot of other organizations could get together and start talking about the question of what does it mean to have non-sexist education in university. Not just a question of curriculum, but it has to do with the culture in the university as well. This also led to a lot of eventually people coming forward about professors being sexually harassing students, and that was a whole explosion in of itself. And this training ground also was important to think about in how feminists then organized. When you actually had the student this year with the explosion of the women's movement in the high schools and university, they used the tactics that they learned from the student movement. They had assemblies where they voted on things. They had they took over the schools in a similar fashion. So it's an important place like to think about that. They it's not like they learned from the student movement, and they were able to use that political experience and the political space that they carved out within that to now kind of create their own demands and to push forward their issues to the fore. The next slide's mine too, I guess, right? Next slide. Oh, actually, we know some of these people. I think that's a picture from, it's like some former El Salad people and some other folks there. And the next one. And this is an image from the recent takeovers of universities. Actually, this is a takeover or an occupation of the Catholic University, which was actually very important because the Catholic University has always been traditionally known as the very right-wing university. And the fact that there are elements, that's weird, but anyways, people inside of it who actually are students and such who are left-leaning is actually very significant. This was the only the only occupation, which I think was actually had to face off against actually more fascist right-wing women who, not in like a really extreme way, because the right-wing women, some of them tried to do somewhat of a takeover of taking it back, but it didn't work out. Anyways, so that was also significant. Did Bree freeze up?
I think
Am I okay?
we can hear you.
Okay. Oh, there you are now.
Very good. Just as an airplane goes over the house.
All right. The next image.
Yeah. So
That's
back to me.
Yeah.
All right. So here we have a broad question. So we've talked about multi-sectoralism, right? The idea of connecting these different movements together and finding strategic demands. So when we are building these types of coalitions, like how do we make them a place where so many different people with different interests not only can cooperate, but all feel like respected as equal? So they have, despite maybe being from different classes, different economic classes, rural versus city, big differences, maybe different political focuses, that they can kind of find enough common ground to advance. So the answer to this question is the application of transversal feminism. So what is transversal feminism? This is a question that I asked Romina like maybe earlier this year, because I kept on seeing it be used. And I was like, Romina, what is this transversal feminism? I see it in all of the documents for organization, but I've never heard of it before. Because as someone who's living in a different country, I came here with some pretty bad Spanish. Now I have some pretty okay Spanish. But that meant that there were not only a lot of general words, but a lot of specific political words that I didn't understand. However, even if I didn't have the words, I knew what we were doing in practice. So in our organization, Solidaridad, we were organized by sector. Right? We had our student front, we had our workers front, we had a health front. And the idea was that instead of having feminism be a separate front, okay, yes, we would have a committee to develop feminism, but that feminism needed to infuse each area of work. So we had to say, what is feminist work in the health industry? What is feminist work in the unions that we participate in? Right? So we had to really consider that feminism not as this abstract, separate thing, but something that needs to be considered in all areas of our lives and struggles. So, as a small organization, we were able to enact some things. Like, for example, with the unions that we had members in, we were able to do some feminist labor trainings as guests of the unions, right? And that includes our Romina and I's favorite union, SeamTech, which is a very, very leftist, amazing construction workers union. So you can have that complete stereotype in your mind of the old guys who haven't shaved their beards with their hard hats, but they are like the best feminists. Like, they're really down. So whenever we see them, we're happy. And they are very good about being open to evolving with the changing times. Okay? So I saw this and I said, yeah, of course we should do it this way. But I didn't know that that was the transversal feminism I'd been reading so much about. So I decided, of course, to start doing some reading to really try to understand what it is. So next slide. Okay. So I was able to see more transversal feminism in practice in the current era of the feminist movement. Right? We've talked a lot about the student feminists, but they were not the only ones. Right? We have labor feminists. We have feminists who are part of the movements against the corrupt pension system. We have feminists in the health industry, right? So even though the students are often the stars because look at them, they look very cool, people love to take photos of them, they are not the only ones. However, right, they were the ones who had the energy in this moment because they had the history of development in the student movement. They know how to do their popular assemblies. They know how to take over institutions. Like Romina said, they had like the knowledge and like the muscle memory of how to act when they feel the moment has arrived. So even though they were not the only or even the most important sector, maybe they were the face of the movement. So next slide. So when the movement started to really kick off, right, and earlier this year, it became very clear that there would be a need for infrastructure of something to kind of bind together all the different university and student groups, but also all of the other feminist organizations or women's organizations that were kind of all getting a collective boost in this moment. So people thought immediately we need to take advantage of this energy, of this momentum to try to bind people together the best way they could. So the group that kind of rose to the occasion was La Coordinadora 8 de Marzo, or C8M, right? Which is the coalition that basically kind of comes together every year to plan the big march and day of activities for International Working Women's Day on March 8th. So beginning of this year, C8M met, they were planning a march, and right, March 8th, and the movement starts kicking off, universities start getting occupied in April. So what was originally meant to be a small temporary coalition, bringing together different groups to organize one day of activities, suddenly was the structure available for the whole movement, kind of grounded or headquartered in Santiago, the capital city. Right? So C8M, their job is to bring together lots of diverse individuals and groups. Like, for example, labor unions, often like the more female-dominated ones, like nurses or public workers, for example, the typical student organizations, territorial organizations, which are groupings based on kind of land, community, and neighborhood, human rights groups, arts and cultural collectives, and now we also have very recently developed immigrants' rights groups. So C8M, yeah, they were definitely able to say, we can bring all these groups together for one big day of action. But then, as things continued to heat up, they realized that actually they needed to bring these groups together for a movement, not just for one day, not just for one march. So the slogan of the march was, yes?
This is Susie. I just want to do a time check. We have another group who comes into our room in 15 minutes, and we'd like time for just even a couple of questions. So I just wanted to let you know that, so you can think about, I don't know how much more time you have in the presentation.
I can shorten it.
Okay.
I would say maybe it's like 15 minutes more, but I could try to go through it pretty quick.
That'd be good. So we have time for at least a couple questions before we have to leave the room.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, so long story short, the idea was this group needed a method to bind all these groups together in the long term, right? And that's where transversal feminism comes in. Next slide. Right? So what is transversal feminism? It's an organizational approach used to generate collective identity and investment in coalitions consisting of participants with diverse positionalities. Like, for example, working class women whose primary labor is in the home, and university students facing sexual harassment in the classroom. The idea is to acknowledge and value that all participants experience oppression or relate to issues differently based on their place in the world. Instead of trying to erase or ignore these differences, participants stay rooted in their own histories while searching out the commonalities that can serve as a basis for creating bonds of solidarity. So in the picture, we have the quote of Patricia Hill Collins saying, "Empathy, not sympathy, becomes the basis of coalition." It's not about guilt politics. It's not about charity, right? It's about finding what holds us together without erasing our differences. So transversal feminism rejects the flattening of identity offered by a lot of traditional leftist universalism, like we're all workers, we're all the same, without exploring more. And it also seeks to reject the excessive relativism of identity politics, which can substitute individual identity for collective identity. Yeah. So next slide. So really quick, so this is a picture of a popular assembly organized by C8M, where lots of different people were brought together. And one of the main topics of a conversation would be to have a goal of something to build to. And the idea was to have a general strike next March 8th. So that would be March 8th of 2019. So the discussion consisted of saying, okay, how do we get from here to there? What would a strike look like? Would it be just a strike of the union members? What would a general strike be for women who are only doing reproductive labor in the home? Or what would a general strike be for women in isolated rural areas? Right? So to discuss that in a deep, authentic way and to try to find solutions. So from this moment on, more popular assemblies have been held. Next slide. Here's an advertisement for one in last June. And next slide. So one of the methods that C8M has been using to build towards the general strike are these pre-encuentros, or pre-meetings. So these are meetings or popular assemblies, right, organized where people active in different areas of struggle, right, or different sectors can come together to discuss how they would or even would not participate in the strike. Like, how do they want to relate to this moment? Is this something for them? Just to have the space to talk, debate, and consider. So at first there were only a few, but now I see tons of them popping up all the time, right? As you can see, they have quite a range. We have like pre-encuentros for just neighborhoods or specific high schools or universities, a pre-encuentro for mental health advocacy, one for art and culture, and many more. Okay? So a lot of these are happening in the capital city of Santiago, but they are also happening throughout the country. So next picture. So when Romina was visiting last, we participated in a meeting where C8M introduced the idea of the general strike to women representing the immigrant domestic workers union, right? And to have a broad conversation about race and feminism. So these women have really difficult work conditions. They're very vulnerable on a lot of ways. So they were skeptical, but also open, right? So instead of coming with empty hands, C&M offered to organize an encuentro specifically for immigrant women, including paying to rent the space, serving food, providing childcare, and handling all aspects of the administration. This offer had no strings attached. It would only be to give women of this sector a little space to breathe so they could collectively consider how to relate to the idea of the general strike in this new feminist movement. So at the end of the meeting, they decided to accept the offer contingent on having their concerns about time and resources addressed. So right now, that kind of brings us up to the present, where we are in a period of building towards the strike. We're having the encuentros. We're having a lot of fierce political debates about the character of the strike or of feminism in general. Right? There's definitely quite a variety of political perspectives happening and debates over strategy and methods. So nothing is fixed. It's a moment of transition, but things are definitely going somewhere. So next slide. All right. The end.
So we only have a couple of minutes. I do want folks who have questions have an opportunity to ask them. We are still live streaming, so if people who don't want to be on the recording, this would be an opportunity to just step out of the room. Okay, so we'll open up the floor for questions. Does anybody have any questions for Romina or Bree? We have one over here.
Yeah, mine's kind of in two parts. Romina, you mentioned that so I get the first one is you mentioned briefly the suffrage movement in Chile, and I'm wondering if the class composition of that movement is similar to what it was in the U.S. And the second part is sort of you mentioned that in the 80s, socialist feminism was sort of the mainstream of feminism, and if the class composition of the suffrage movement was similar to in the U.S., how did that change to be a socialist feminist movement in a few decades after?
Sure. The suffrage movement was actually in the 1930s, or I think it started kind of before that, but the 20s and 30s and 40s represented various different classes. So you actually had, it actually wasn't very known for a lot of elite women being part of it. It was more middle class, but a lot of middle class women that were also connected to either socialism or sort of Catholic social work aspect too, right? So those were two aspects, and their main work was either, if they were middle class, it was supporting working class women, but it wasn't necessarily an organization that represented a lot of working class women like the suffrage movement did in England, which was actually had a very heavy working class element to it. But it wasn't very similar, I would say, either to the United States. I think they cared more about working class women than a lot of US suffrage, which is mostly representative of their own interests. Well, they fought for suffrage to try to to kind of better the conditions of working class women too, if that makes sense. So I think the 80s, a lot of those same individuals from between the 40s and the 80s, they had kind of been involved in their political organizations since then. So maybe by the 80s, some of their politics was even more developed when thinking about socialism and feminism than the previous period.
Any other questions?
I had a question about how men have been effectively engaged, and also the ongoing project of transforming organizations to make them accountable to move forward to transform the labor movement into a feminist movement, or the student movement into a feminist movement overall.
What was the first part?
It was about effective strategies for, you talked about the women moving into women's spaces, to talk about how, say, in educational environments or in their own organizations, they were needing to speak and to understand how the organization, say a student organization overall, was stifling women's voices and leadership. And I'm wondering about the transformation of those organizations, of the movement organizations overall. In other words, men being able to share the leadership space in those organizations.
Well, I can start. I was just going to start with like I think there's been, we didn't kind of go into the growing pains, but since 2011 and also the eruption, kind of the slow eventual to the eruption of the feminist movement, there has been a lot of things that have happened. There's been a lot of political fights. There's been a lot of expulsions. There's been a lot of breaking of organizations, or almost breaking of organizations, splitting of organizations. A lot of this, not all of it, but a lot of it has to do with questions of thinking about feminism. And a lot of people were, I think a lot of men were confronted with this for the first time. And you would hear comments like, well, I don't know what to say. You give me the reading list and then I'll look it up. And so it was a lot of, I think this last year represented kind of like, after the year before was, I would say, a very painful year. And then this year representative kind of like a more positive of like, after like the infighting, the breaking, which was necessary, it's now the period of construction, right? So Bree.
So maybe I totally agree with what Romina said, because we got to see some shit, right? There were some pretty intense fights, but I would say for me, something that I saw that had a lot of value in it is when you are part of a social organization or a political organization. In the US, it was my experience that when there were some bad vibes, like there were some people who were being a little macho, talking over other people, like instead of like trying to change it or confronting it, there was like this slow, quiet exodus of people who didn't like the vibe, right? That there were not enough moments where people said, yeah, no, we need to, this is my organization, and my organization is a feminist one, right? Like being able to claim the space as yours, not thinking of it as this like other space that you are trying out, you're dipping your toe into to see if it's okay. Like as an anarchist, like it is, an organization belongs to everyone equally, right? And that is a right, but also like a responsibility, right? You have to try to assert yourself. That doesn't mean staying in a place that's totally toxic. You have to be the judge of that. You have to say if something has potential or not. My second thought on that was that something I noticed was that when the student movement started to take this feminist turn, is that a lot of the men, or the boys in some cases, did not want to be left behind. There were some very funny joke memes being circulated where someone had screenshotted a conversation where a student militant, like a student activist boy, like was like, comrade, why can't I come to the occupation? I'm deconstructed, right? Is that after being used to being like leaders and super active in every student thing, they felt so sad about being left out. And that doesn't mean that everyone instantly became feminist, but definitely they felt the social pressure to be. And social pressure is very powerful, right? So now I can see some things like, you know, a lot of really young dudes, like dudes in their early 20s or high school students who have like better feminism than I did at that age. So I think part of it is like the desire to belong. And if we can make feminism or this way of thinking more dominant, some people will not want to be left behind, right? And that could be the beginning of a transformation, if not the end.
Yeah, it reminded me when I recently went to, because I'm also an academic and I work on like education and race in Chile. And I went to this event at a high school. I think I told Bree about it. And there was like these high schools, there was 3 or 4 high schools there that had tables about archival research they do in their high school. And I had a 13 and 14-year-old boy explain to me that he was from an all-boys school, but they were researching the history of the old girls' school that was connected to their school in 1908. And they were like, this is our main research. What we care about is gender. And I was like, this is incredible to have a 13, 14-year-old boy kind of like talking about how it like trickles down, you know, to the younger generations and like and forcing them to think about their role and also being in a privileged all-boys school.
Well, unfortunately, we're out of time for today, but I want to thank both of you for thinking through your presentation so thoughtfully and being with us today. Thanks, Romina and Bree. It's great to see you.
Bye.